Welcome to this video guide for my Blade Vortex Poison Pathfinder in Path of Exile. This is a companion video to the written forum guide. You can see a link to that in the description. The main purpose of this being to show off some of the gameplay footage so you can see how the build plays, and I'll be showing just a high-level red map going through that, and then there's some delve at the end. I'll also in the middle walk you through the gearing choices and the jewels that make this build work, and then give some conclusions at the end as to whether maybe you would enjoy playing this build as well. But what motivated me to make this build is I really like the gameplay of Blade Vortex because it has great clear speed and it's just an aesthetically kind of pleasing skill. I like how it looks, but most of the Blade Vortex characters I've played end up being really squishy. So what'll end up happening is you're zooming through a map and then everything is dying, but then suddenly something hits you and you die instantly. And it's hard to make a Blade Vortex character very tanky because it's a primarily dexterity skill, and if you're over on the shadow side of the tree, your defenses are coming from evasion and dodge, and so this character tends to be kind of squishy and vulnerable to big damage hits. And especially in the Delirium League that we're doing now, there's a big priority put on high clear speed so you can go through deliriums, but especially in higher tier maps, the delirium mobs you run into become pretty dangerous and it's easy to get one-shotted. So this is my attempt to solve that problem using some very specific pieces of gear on my Poison Vortex character. And most of the Blade Vortex characters using poison do it with the assassin ascendancy. I've decided to do it with Pathfinder instead. The main reason is we're giving up a little bit of damage in aid of having better defenses, and Pathfinder gets the benefit of pretty much constant Flask uptime, also reduced elemental damage taken, and immunity to elemental ailments, and Blade Vortex has such overall insane damage when it's well geared that I feel like that's a sacrifice that is pretty easily worth making. So the advantage of the build is it's great for clearing maps and delve. The disadvantage is it's kind of expensive, the gearing is kind of specific, and I'll talk about that in a second, and compared to the assassin version, it's not quite as good at melting bosses. Let me walk you through the gearing process for this build because there's some very specific items that are needed in order to make it work. And a lot of those are in the jewel sockets. So what I'm using, I've got this Watcher's Eye, the key part being unaffected by poison while affected by malevolence, combined with the golden rule so that poison we inflict is inflicted back on us, and it gives additional chaos resistance per poison inflicted. Then that combines with a glorious Vanity in the name of Zibiqua to give divine flesh so that 50% of elemental damage taken is chaos resist and 10% to max chaos resist. So 85% maximum chaos resist, which we hit pretty quickly because we inflict a lot of poisons with Blade Vortex. Those poisons get reflected onto us with the golden rule, but they don't do any damage because of the Watcher's Eye. Then that chaos resistance cap is further increased by the use of Apep Supremacy, which gives us 3% to all maximum resistances, so both elemental and chaos while we are poisoned. It also makes poisons on us expire 50% slower, so it's easier to keep up the cap of 100 poisons on us at all times so that we've got maxed out chaos res, and that effectively reduces the elemental damage that we're taking by a pretty high percentage. So even the stuff that we don't dodge using the phase acro and acrobatics, we are able to avoid a lot of it because of the damage taken as chaos. So that kind of leads us into the rest of the gear. So in the chest, I'm using Lightning Coil to do a further conversion, moving physical damage taken over to lightning. And because Apep Supremacy is giving us overcapped lightning resist, then that's a further reduction in the physical damage taken, and that's where I've got my Blade Vortex set up. So it's linked to Unleash, and then Unbound Ailments, Poison, Vile Toxins, Deadly Ailments. And that setup doesn't really need to change ever. It's fine for bosses and just we just leave it like that all the time. In the gloves, I'm using the Embalmer for a little bit more poison damage, and that's where I've got all the auras. So Herald of Agony increases our poison chance. It also actually does a pretty respectable amount of damage itself, even though we're not really supporting it with anything. It still does about 70,000 DPS just from having the Agony Crawler up. One other effect of the Golden Rule is it makes it very easy to keep on maximum virulence stacks for Herald of Agony. Then we've got Purity of Lightning, which offsets the negative lightning resistance from Lightning Coil and also gives us further buffs to our maximum lightning resistance. So when we're not poisoned with anything, then Purity of Lightning is getting us to 79% lightning resist, and then when we're poisoned, that goes up to 82 because of Apep's Supremacy. And then we've got Malevolence, and all supported by Enlighten, so that we've got enough mana. The gloves have +1 to Socketed Gems Corruption, which is convenient in buffing the Enlighten up to a level 5. That's not strictly necessary. It would be possible to do it with less mana, but it's kind of convenient. The boots hold our movement setup, so I've got Blood Magic, faster attacks linked to Whirling Blades. If you wanted, you could swap out faster attacks for a dash gem, which I was doing for part of the time, and then that's linked to Fortify to get that buff up while just moving around through mobs. The helmet is where I've got the Plague Bearer set up, and this, you can't really support it with anything except additional gem levels or increased area of effect, and the helmet, I picked this out primarily because it has some physical damage taken as cold as one of the helmet effects, in addition to the Blade Vortex enchant. So, and then it's got crafted on there the +1 to level of socketed AoE gems, which gives a buff to Plague Bearer, but nothing else really increases the damage aside from additional levels. But Plague Bearer is just incredibly powerful all by itself. You can run around with that on and it will just kill packs of monsters for several seconds, and I don't even have it over leveled yet. It's only a level 19 +1 from the item, so it could get significantly more powerful, and it's already very good. And this is where I also have my Blasphemy set up, so Blasphemy linked to Temporal Chains. And this is made possible by the Solstice Vigil amulet, which gives 100% reduced mana reservation for Temporal Chains. This is nice both for defensive reasons because enemies are slowed. It also means that poisons on them last a little bit longer, so you can stack more poisons. It does improve the DPS a little bit, but the primary benefit of that is it makes it, when you have Shaper's Presence, all the effects on you last 20% longer, so poisons on you last longer, as well as the Blade Vortex stacks, so it's just a nice quality of life move. The other pieces of jewelry are rings, the main job of those being to cap out resistances. I was lucky enough to get this one with increased damage with poison on it, which you can get with an essence craft, so that gives me a little bit of DPS. And then the Circle of Nostalgia, and this needs to have a reduced mana reservation on Herald of Agony in order to make that possible to run with all of our other auras, and then just give some increased chaos damage. I was, again, pretty lucky to get some really good implicits on this with the minus chaos damage taken and minus lightning damage taken. No guarantee that that sort of thing will always be available, but those are the sorts of things to look for on the Circle of Nostalgia. One thing worth noting is that this build is very, very tight on having enough attributes to run everything, because we need to have 159 intelligence in order to have Apep Supremacy on, and the build does not really path into very much intelligence nodes. So I've got this Fertile Mind Jewel, and that's responsible for about 70 intelligence. Without it, I couldn't run much of anything, and Fertile Mind was just the easiest solution compared to trying to get a bunch of really high intelligence rolls on my already rather strained gear. Lastly, just the belt. The main job of it is to cap out resistances, and a Rustic Sash does give some increased damage because physical scales our poison. For the weapon, the Cold Iron Point is a pretty obvious choice. It just gives +3 levels to our Blade Vortex, so a nice DPS increase, and again, getting the Corruption for increased damage over time is not strictly necessary, but it does help out with the damage a little bit further. So if you were trying to do this build on a slightly lower budget. Well, it's replacing the Cold Iron Point with an uncorrupted one. This was, I think, 7 Exalts versus like 8 or 10 Chaos. You could get a Cold Iron Point without that implicit on it. So that alone reduces the cost of the build a lot. The Malevolence Watcher's Eye with the dual effect of unaffected by poison plus damaging ailments. That's kind of expensive. It was, I think, 7 Exalts, and I think I got a good deal on that. But if you got one that just had the unaffected by poison and then maybe something like damage taken as lightning, I picked this one up for 40 Chaos. So very, very cheap. Not many people care about just the unaffected by poison in a purely defensive Watcher's Eye. And there's a case to be made that this is actually the better one to be running because it gives a little bit more damage reduction by having physical taken as lightning. Then, lastly, the Solstice Vigil Amulet. Earlier in the league, this was ridiculously expensive. I was lucky enough to have one just drop off of Shaper, but it's still a couple of Exalts, I think. You could use Impresence instead for a slightly cheaper option. This actually does give a little bit higher DPS when it's paired with a Despair aura. So it gives a little bit more boss DPS if you use Impresence instead of Solstice Vigil, and it's a little bit cheaper, but the quality of life from slowing everything as well as having Blade Vortex last longer makes me really like having Solstice Vigil to run whenever possible. The last thing to comment on are the flasks. Because this is a Pathfinder, the main perk of using that ascendancy is that we get to have constant flask uptime. So just a life flask. Taste of Hate does not do anything for our damage normally, but having physical taken as cold gives another significant reduction to incoming damage. At Zeri's Promise, scales our damage by giving some physical as extra chaos, and when it's paired with Taste of Hate, it converts the cold from Taste of Hate into additional chaos. So even though we can't do any elemental damage because of Cold Iron Point, with that Zeri's Promise, then Taste of Hate actually does increase our DPS a little bit. And then Corralito's Signature, just a classic for any sort of a poison build. The increased duration of poisons inflicted during Flask effect is nice with the Golden Rule, because it means that poisons on us last a little bit longer, and it's just a significant damage increase while this is running. And so if you're only able to have one of these flasks, Corralito's Signature is the most impactful one to have just in terms of pure DPS. But running at Zeri's Promise, the leech is actually pretty significant because we do a lot of chaos damage. The cluster jewels we're using, we've got Master the Fundamentals for increased physical, but more importantly, Grim Oath is giving us physical as extra chaos, and we've got Unholy Might running because of Overwhelming Malice. So all that being said, at Zeri's Promise is actually leeching quite a bit of chaos damage for us as life, so while that's running, we sustain pretty easily. And then there's just a Quicksilver Flask of warding. So that's the build. I have it at level 89 now, and all that's left really are picking up a few more life nodes, and that's just about it. I think I could pretty easily take this into the early 90s. That's usually where I stop my characters, because after that it becomes just such a grind. But the build feels pretty much complete to me at this point, and I've been really happy with how it's turned out. I think it's done what I wanted, which is to have a tankier version of Blade Vortex, which stacks a lot of dodge chance combined with elemental conversions to reduce incoming physical and elemental damage, and this gearing has given a slightly lower DPS compared to an Assassin Ascendancy Blade Vortex, but it's been successful in being a little bit better at not dying in Delirium mobs, so I've been able to complete the red map Deliriums that have given some of my other builds, including my other Blade Vortex builds, a pretty hard time. So overall, I'm going to consider this build a success, and I would encourage other people to give it a try. I know I'm not the first person to think of the Golden Rule, Divine Flesh, and Apep Supremacy combination, but I think this combination of gear works very, very nicely when you're doing it with a Blade Vortex character, and the new cluster jewel system added in the Delirium League adds a little bit more utility and some damage to a character that is otherwise pretty restrictive when it comes to the gearing selection. So while I would say this is not necessarily a good league starting character because the gearing for it is very particular and specific, at this stage in the league, about a month in, when gear has become a bit cheaper, I think this is a fun way to to do a very fast delving, fast mapping character to really farm for those delirium rewards, and I will definitely be revisiting this in some future leagues because I think it has a lot of potential, and the core of the build, which is a lot of damage reduction combined with a fast moving high damage skill, I think will pretty much always be good. So thanks for watching. Check out the forum guide in the description and hit subscribe if you'd like to see more content from my YouTube channel in the future.